Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan here in Tokyo, and welcome to this breakfast meeting, or Asa-kai. I'm Anthony Rowley. I'm a former president of the club, and it's my genuine, sincere pleasure today to act as moderator and introduce our guest for today, who's seated to my right, of course, who is Charles Dallara, a very prominent figure in the world of international finance. Dr. Dallara has spoken at this club on a number of past occasions, but let me take this opportunity to formally welcome you to the new club, our new premises. Thank you. Dr. Dallara is a partner, a member of the board of directors, and also chairman of the Americas for Partners Group, which some of you will know is a private markets investment group that has some $75 billion of assets under management and is the second largest such group in the world in terms of market capitalization. Dr. Dallara has kindly agreed to spare some time today during what is actually a very packed schedule to offer his perspectives on recent developments in the international economy and in global financial markets. He's just come fresh from Beijing, where he had meetings with a number of key Chinese officials, and I'm sure he'll be able to offer us some interesting insights on Trump trade wars, among other things. Prior to joining Partners Group, Dr. Dallara was for a number of years managing director and chief executive officer at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, D.C. The IMF, as many of you know, has some of the world's leading banks and other financial institutions among its members. And Dr. Dallara played a key role during the Greek sovereign debt crisis 10 years ago in negotiating on behalf of some of those institutions with key figures in Europe, such as Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany and then French President Nicolas Sarkozy. So he's very well accustomed to dealing with crises. Our speaker has a number of other claims to fame. He served as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury during the administrations of Presidents George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, and also as U.S. Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. He's also been a Managing Director at J.P. Morgan and Company. Dr. Dallara holds bachelor's and master's degrees in economics, law, and diplomacy from prestigious American universities. We're rather tight on time, so I hope you'll forgive me if I don't spare more time on his resume. Let me just please ask you all, if you have a cell phone, to switch it off or put it on silent mode as a courtesy to our speaker. Let me just briefly say that we also have in the audience from Partners Group Mr. Shunsuke Tanahashi, who is General Manager for Japan and Senior Vice President of the group. And we also have Dr. Dallara's wife, who's kindly joined us this morning, seated over there. So please join me in welcoming them to the club.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be with you here at these beautiful new facilities of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I do recall your old facilities, having spoken there a few times, and they were quite inviting and comfortable, but this is quite impressive. And I congratulate you on these new environments, which I'm sure will see many interesting exchanges of view. In fact, as Anthony said, I believe, although I cannot verify this with certainty, that my first appearance at the FCCJ was in the spring of 1986. Can anyone imagine what I was doing roaming around Asia in the spring of 1986? I'll give you one hint. My trip involved a stop in Taipei, a stop in Seoul, and a stop in Tokyo. No stops in Beijing in those days. No clue?
Can I suggest the Plaza Accord, maybe?
Yes, Anthony's hit the nail on the head. In the fall of 1985, as some of you may recall, we negotiated, and I was at the Treasury at the time, working with Secretary James Baker, this Plaza Accord, which was an important agreement involving the U.S., Japan, Germany, the UK, and France, to, in effect, devalue the dollar and stimulate activity outside the U.S. that would improve our trade situation. At the time, we reached an agreement, which was very tough to negotiate with Japan and Europe, because it meant that the Japanese yen would have to appreciate significantly. But it needed to. At the time, if you can imagine, you look today, what is the rate, around 113 yen dollar? At the time we began to negotiate the Plaza Accord, this was in the spring of 1985, can anyone hazard to guess what the dollar-yen exchange rate was? Yes, sir. 242. That's an excellent guess. Give that man an extra cup of coffee. 242. Can you imagine the competitive problems that presented for the U.S. at 242 and the competitive advantages it presented to Japan? But Japan followed with diligence and a commitment, a path of appreciation. What we had not against the dollar, what we had not anticipated was that the Korean and Taiwanese authorities would move linked to the dollar, not linked to the yen. So we were regaining a little bit of competitive edge with Japan and Europe, but we were gaining no competitive edge with Taiwan and Korea. And of course, our friends in Tokyo were understandably upset about this. So we had to have some very tough negotiations in those days with Korea and Taiwan, but we succeeded after a lot of bilateral and multilateral pressure. Having lived through those days of trade tensions between the U.S. and Japan, I must say my recent visit to Beijing does bring back some sense of déjà vu. Before I move to that, though, let me say again what a pleasure it is to have both my wife and my colleague here this morning. My wife, Beijing, is also with Asian roots, 1,299 miles northwest of Tokyo. Does anyone guess that city? Come on, your knowledge of Asian geography surely would land on Beijing. It's the same distance, Kansas City, west of New York. But it's a pleasure to be out here with her, and also my colleague Shun Tanahashi. We have a strong team here at Partners Group, and I will say a few words about this later, working with Japanese clients who are looking for investment opportunities overseas. And we also explore, as one of the world's leading private equity firms, opportunities to invest in Japan. Anthony gave for you and for me a rather daunting title to my remarks. I think market instability, trade wars, and the need for long-term perspectives. But I think in some ways, although it is provocative, it is suitable and timely for today. I believe we are living not just in especially challenging times, but especially complex times. And I have not seen during my career so many of the fundamental pillars and principles that have guided the world economy and the global geopolitical system for 60 years being called into question. In fact, you see populism spreading around the world of democracies, like what we call in the U.S. kudzu. Do you know what the Japanese term for that is? Japanese arrowroot. Does anyone know what Japanese arrowroot is? It's a vine. It's a vine, and it's an aggressive vine. And we have benefited in America from many wonderful things that you have exported to us in the United States, but this is not one of them. In 1876, Japan brought to the Philadelphia World Expo Japanese arrowroot, and it spread around America. Today, it is considered, in many places, an unwelcome vine because it is aggressive. It covers other vines and prevents them from receiving sun or water. In the South, where I grew up, there is much kudzu, and it will grow very quickly on a wall, and it will shroud and cover the other vines. Today we have populism growing like kudzu, covering and clouding the more basic fundamental forces which should guide our democracies. I don't think, despite the fact that kudzu came from Japan, I don't think you have as much kudzu in your political system as we do, but I think we all have to be concerned about it because it is infectious, and it creates a world of delusions, of false illusions, of notions that we have outgrown the post-war institutions, that we must each fight for our own place in the world because there is no win-win cooperative framework. It creates the illusion that nationalism is patriotism. It creates the illusion that protecting my industries will help my people. There are a lot of illusions circulating around the world today, some of which are delusions as well. I think we should acknowledge, however, that this is not just a reflection of President Trump or populists in Europe, such as Mr. Orban in Hungary, or populists in Latin America, such as the new president of Brazil. We should dial the clock back a little bit and recognize that what we are struggling to deal with today reflects considerably the vast disruptions of the last decade. And let me spend a minute on this. Can anyone recall, I realize I'm asking a lot of questions for a Friday morning breakfast, and you're supposed to be asking the questions, but I hope you don't mind, and you're getting better at the responses. 10 years ago exactly, November 16th, what was happening in the world? Roll your minds back. I'm sure many of you were covering it. Many of you were writing about it. Many of you could Google your own articles today.
Maybe global financial crisis?
Well, the global financial crisis, which had been roaring in a very remarkable fashion at that point for 2 months. And on the 16th of November, a decade ago, we were all of us applauding, but we weren't applauding too loudly. We were applauding like this, a G20 statement which emerged from Washington. President Bush in office as a lame duck. President Obama had just been elected the prior week or week and a half. But President Bush convened a G20 meeting in Washington to try to provide a framework of stability. It has in it some rather amazing declarations. They asked their finance officials to identify financial institutions that could jeopardize the global economic system. Well, unfortunately, the collapse of Lehman had already begun to shred the global economic system. If I look back, I believe that the decision to allow Lehman to fail, coming on the heels of the decision to bail out Bear Stearns, those combined decisions were remarkably ill-advised. Remarkably ill-advised. Yes, bankers had made many mistakes, and the world was vulnerable. But when the world is vulnerable, you don't try to prick the balloon unless you know what's inside it. And that's what happened when the U.S. authorities decided to allow Lehman to fail. There can be many reflections on this, although many books written about the crisis haven't really addressed so clearly, did it really have to happen? As you know, the world of trade virtually collapsed. The U.S. economy in the fourth quarter of 2008 destroyed over 400, in fact, in the month of November alone. In the month of November alone, we destroyed over 400,000 jobs. And the entirety of U.S. and Europe, with some effect here, became a black hole of trade. Trade shrunk for a period of 6 months by 16%. I have never lived through anything like it. Every day I arose, I would get a call from another banker saying, I need help from my central bank. I cannot survive. And often I would be asked somewhat as an intermediary to facilitate the dialogue. Sometimes they needed help from other central banks. The Australians needed liquidity from New York. It wasn't coming. They needed help from the New York Fed. Many bankers were desperate, and many companies closed their doors. The result is that we went through a decade of severe adjustment. U.S. unemployment went to 10%. We have gone through this period of recovery, but the recovery is not a full-fledged recovery as it appears. And that's important to understand the dynamics between economic recovery and the stresses and strains on democracy. We knew that we needed to stress test our banking system after the crisis. What we didn't realize is that we were also going to embark on a stress test of our democracies. That's what we've done. We put them under tremendous stress, particularly in the U.S. and Europe. Why? Well, some of it relates to the longer term shifts in the factors of production, which have eroded the demand for certain unskilled and marginally skilled labor in the process of production. But some of it relates to the process of globalization that was accelerated as a result of the crisis. When we created new jobs coming out of this severe recession, we replaced $16 an hour jobs with $12 an hour jobs. You in Japan replaced many full-time jobs with part-time jobs. Now, some of my Japanese friends tell me this suits the younger generation, or it suits some of the older female workers who were coming back into the workforce. Perhaps that is true. But if you want to build and sustain a middle class, and if you want to sustain reasonable dispersion between high-income earners and low-income earners, this is not the recipe. In 1970, when I graduated from college, the middle class, as defined then in our country, generated over 70% of the net income generated in American households. Today, that figure is close to 40%. We have lived in a world where longer-term factors of globalization and factors of evolution in our industrial systems, accelerated by the crisis, have created a large number of disenfranchised in pockets of our economies. One even senses this is beginning to be an issue in Japan, where your wealth dispersion is beginning to appear, perhaps for the first time since the war. Ergo, we elected a president who appears to provide answers for these solutions to many of the disenfranchised. It's also important to keep in mind that in America we've gone through a period of acute focus on minorities. And this was warranted in many respects because we have a history of not fairly treating minorities. But under President Obama, many Americans in the majority, particularly white middle-class males, felt that they were ignored. They were lost. They were not part of the focus of attention and policies. This also created to the results of 2016. Meanwhile, I think as we sit here today, it's also very important to realize that Europe has really never emerged from the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. Look at the unemployment rates. Today, Italian unemployment is 10%. Net growth in the Italian economy since the creation of the euro. Another question for this distinguished audience: what is net growth? Net growth in the Italian economy, 20 years it's been since the euro was launched. Come on, you can take a risk. I know this is Japan, but you can take a risk. 0%, flat, nada, nunca. There has been no growth. So the Italians propose a 2.5% fiscal deficit, and they are being heavily criticized by Brussels and Berlin. When we ran in the US a 10% unemployment rate, which is exactly what Italy has today, we had a 10% fiscal deficit. I'm not trying to defend irresponsible spending plans by populist politicians in Europe, but I will tell you that any system that indicts and condemns a 2.5% fiscal deficit when you have 10% unemployment is not a system that works. I spent almost 2 years of my life negotiating the Greek debt, private Greek debt restructuring, which remains the largest debt restructuring in history. And when introduced to give a speech a few years ago by a friend of mine, he said, "Let me introduce to you the man who saved Greece." And I corrected him. I said, "Well, it was a team effort, but in any case, we didn't save Greece, we saved Europe." By that I meant that we preserved the stability of the euro, but the Greek economy has been really an unmitigated disaster because of ill-advised program designed by the IMF in Europe and inadequate support, as well as the longer-term structural problems of Greece. All of us are focused today on Brexit, and I'll come back to Brexit. But I think we have to realize that as we sit here today, Europe is close to being dysfunctional from a broad macroeconomic point of view. We still find investment opportunities there. I'm in the process of helping to implement a huge wind farm my company bought off the coast of Germany. It would generate electricity for millions of German households. And it's going to be a profitable investment for us and for our clients. So I'm not implying that one cannot find investment opportunities in Europe, but I am saying that the broad framework is unstable. Let's talk a bit about this part of the world, however, because I know there is a lot of interest in the U.S.-China trade war. In some ways, I think that there is a reality to this that we must try to understand and view this as potentially the first phase of a broader period of competition between the U.S. and China. It may be that what we see today as a trade war is really a trade skirmish, and that the real war will be a technology and investment war. I say that because I do not think that in the end, bilateral trade deficits can be the focal point. I do not even think that trade restrictions can be the focal point, although I do believe that it is fair to acknowledge that just as the United States became fatigued by Japan's barriers in the 1980s, so the U.S. has become fatigued by the trade barriers imposed by China today. And I think that one reason why we have in America today such bipartisan support for this trade conflict is because there is a broad view, nearly a consensus, that China has taken advantage of the global system at the expense of American workers. I believe there is some legitimacy to that. At the same time, I believe those problems can be worked out, but it will take some time. It will take some time, especially because, in contrast to the negotiations that I was involved in heavily throughout the 1980s, there is this overlay of strategic competition for world leadership in technology, and there are military tensions which did not exist at all between the U.S. and Japan. Once at the end of a long negotiation that I had with one of my close Japanese friends in 1989, we had a free weekend together before we resumed negotiations the following Monday. And he said, "Charles, let's go out of town and see some of Japan." I said, "Okay, let's go to Sasebo." "Why Sasebo?" I said, "Because as a young Navy midshipman in 1969, I was still in college, I spent a few weeks in Sasebo on my way to Vietnam." He said, "Okay, I have never been, so I don't know what we're going to see, but let's go." Well, we took a plane, then took a car, and when we arrived, it was fascinating. I saw throughout the military harbor there American and Japanese ships moored together, working together, operating together. Now, I know you do not have a formal Navy that can operate in any fashion possible because of constraints that have come out of your history in Japan. However, I discovered you had a strong Navy, and that it was like many things military between the U.S. and Japan. Even during the height of trade tensions, there was a close alliance and working relationship. That does not exist today, obviously, between the U.S. and China. I think we are going to have to find some short-term understandings in the form of a truce, which hopefully will suspend further tariff increases, although there is no assurance that that will happen. But there is I think, reasonable possibility that such a truce can be agreed in order to allow for more intense negotiations on the very complicated and difficult issues of technology. During the 1980s, when I was negotiating with Japan, there was not the same complex, interrelated supply chain that has grown up today. There were, of course, already U.S. investments in Japan and some Japanese investments in the U.S. But at that stage, complex supply chains had not yet really been developed. Today, trying to disrupt and disentangle those supply chains will be extraordinarily difficult, and in my view, ill-advised. But I can see that there will be pressures in this direction, which could weaken not just the Chinese and U.S. economies, but weaken the global economy. I was reminded in thinking about the risks of a long-term trade war and a long-term technology war of a quote by Confucius, which I will paraphrase. Now, I know that Confucius was from China a millennia and a half ago, but I think his wisdom is respected by all of us. And he said, "If you seek revenge, you had better prepare 2 graves." I would paraphrase and say that if you seek protectionism, you had better be prepared for everyone to lose, because I think that is the risk that we stand today. You know, I chaired an organization called the CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It is not new. When do you think it was formed? And what do you think it was formed in the context of? I know I'm asking another tough question here. I'll answer that one. 1975. It was created in the aftermath of the oil price shock out of fear of investment by Middle East, not by Japan. But in 1988, I chaired this committee, and the first really difficult case I had to block was Fujitsu trying to buy Fairchild Semiconductor. 30 years ago, we were involved in protecting our semiconductor industry. So the Chinese must realize it's nothing new for us to be concerned about protecting our technology. Today, we have amended the law just in August, and it broadens the net of cases that will be reviewed and potentially blocked coming out of China. It's very crucial that we not overreact to this risks that some see as a threat from China. Because I think in the end, although there can be rogue actors in any country, China is coming to a view that they have to do a better job of respecting global standards for trade and investment. And I have encouraged my friends and former colleagues at the Treasury not to overreact. Their job is not only to protect national security, but protect open markets and all that comes from such open, thriving markets. If you look at the landscape in the U.S. today and you ask, what would it be like without Japanese investment? It's hard to imagine. Not a state exists. Maybe North Dakota, I don't know, but hardly a state exists without significant Japanese investment. 15 miles from my hometown, Mitsubishi has just invested another $100 million on a chemicals plant that produces actually a form of industrial film that is used in packaging. It's a rather obscure industrial product maybe to us, but this is the second investment they have made of $100 million. And we see this throughout the economy. There's no reason why China cannot invest in the U.S., but we must find some new rules of the game for this to happen. Let me stop and talk for one moment about what we can anticipate, I think, not just in the months ahead, but over the years ahead in these trade tensions. I think it's important to recognize that it takes time to build understanding. It takes even more time to build trust. The U.S. and Japan spent, as one of my friends here knows because he was involved, the better part of a decade, from the early 80s to the early 90s, in very difficult, intense negotiations. But what happened in the course of that is that you realize that you need to listen as well as project your own views. And you need to understand the perspective of your counterparty. And eventually, what seems like an adversary becomes part adversary and part collaborator, part partner. Even during the height of talks we had in the late 80s called Structural Impediments Initiative, I sat down on a weekend with my good friend Makoto Utsumi, and we negotiated support for the Brady Plan. Why? Because we had built up trust and understanding. We could compartmentalize our trade differences and realize that we both needed to deal with the latent debt problem. Japan contributed $10 billion, crucial dollars, of backstop funding for the zero coupon bonds of the Brady Plan. The Brady Plan may have never succeeded without Japanese support, and Japanese support would have never emerged if we had not engaged in long-term negotiations. So do not expect these differences between the U.S. and China to be resolved in a matter of months. Yes, there may be some truce, there may be some agreements, but both sides need to do more to sit around the table. They're not doing enough direct communication, in my view, today. As we try to sort through these problems in our political and financial systems, we also need to recognize that the markets around us are changing. And this will be my final remarks. In the mid-1990s, there were in the public markets of the U.S. 8,000 listed companies representing 20 trillion of market cap. Today, that number has almost declined by half the number of listed companies, and the market cap has tripled. You have had a growing concentration of stocks that are available to investors in the publicly traded markets. In the meantime, the private market world that I operate in today has continued to expand with more and more opportunities and choices for investors. It was small in the mid-1990s, only $500 billion, 500 billion. Today, while the public markets have grown in market cap threefold, the private markets have grown tenfold. Why is this? It's largely because of different governance models. How is it that private equity can generate fairly steadily, even in difficult markets, returns of 10 to 15%, whereas public markets will have 22% one year and negative 2% the next year? Of course, there is much more volatility in public markets. There's much more sentiment. We do not have to get up every day. If we own a long-term asset, we do not have to get up worrying about how the markets will react to the Federal Reserve the previous day. We can focus on medium and long-term value creation. And I think that this is posing a big challenge to the governance of firms which are listed in the public markets. Many of them you have seen have engaged in buybacks. What is a buyback? It's a way of using your capital without investing in your business, right? You simply take the capital that you have, you go into the market and buy back your stock, you give an artificial lift to your stock. But do you really invest in your business? It poses a long-term question, in my view, about the future of publicly traded equity markets, especially now that those markets are in a governance model that is more and more detached. How many of you have seen the trend toward passive investing? In a world of passive investing, who is really governing these firms? The managements? The boards? We have engaged in a new strategy at Partners Group, which we feel quite confident in. Of course, we are exposed to the same risk in many ways that the publicly traded equity markets are. But we can focus on long-term entrepreneurial ownership while we create a board of directors that is actively engaged and incentivized through compensation structures to generate value in a team-like environment between board and management. This does not exist so often in the publicly traded markets, and I think that if we have an opportunity, if you're kind enough a decade from now to invite me back, it'll be interesting to see what has happened in this evolution between public and private markets and whether or not this model of long-term entrepreneurial governance is gathering even more steam. This is something that I can feel, even here in Japan, is beginning to take hold as you have the growth of your own private equity markets here. My firm operates globally. We have not invested so much in Japan, although we have invested some, but we invest heavily in corporate buyouts in the US and Europe, to a certain extent in India, in China, in Latin America, and other emerging markets. And we see a bright future for the world of private equity investments. Let me stop now. I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you, and I'd be delighted to exchange a few views. And you can ask the questions now instead of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Please feel free to sit down now if you like, and we'll remove the podium. You can relax. Well, thank you for a very interesting and insightful presentation. Consider yourself invited back for 10 years' time. We'll be. Before I open the floor, can I just ask you one quick question, since you mentioned share buybacks? I've seen it suggested that one of the reasons why the markets went into not a collapse, but a plunge about a month ago was because the buybacks suddenly stopped for reasons people were on vacation or whatever. Do you think this is a major factor behind the stock market plunge at that time? Or?
Well, I think it was a factor. I'm not so certain it was a major factor, but I do think that buybacks are another form of sugar, just like quantitative easing has been in the U.S. By that I mean that we have, through these expansionary monetary policies, which we have in the U.S., Europe, and Japan, we've elevated certain asset valuations. And certainly in the U.S., not now in Japan, and not quite yet in Europe, but certainly in the U.S., we're trying to normalize monetary policy. We're taking away a little of this extraordinary support. I think in some ways buybacks also provided a bit of an extra cushion that might be part of the artificial valuations that you see in some assets, in some markets, and investors become, unfortunately, somewhat dependent on the expectation of buybacks, just as they have become dependent on the expectations of monetary easing, especially in the United States.
Okay, well, as we're relatively short of time today, we'll take questions from the floor generally. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Yes, this gentleman here, please. If you can come to the microphone and identify yourself, please, and put your question.
Thank you so much. I'm John Armand from the Canadian Embassy. Thank you for the excellent overview. And I was very interested, we do actually hear a little bit about the Plaza Accord these days. It's sort of come back up in some discussions, especially because some aspects, too, of the current trade frictions maybe look back to the 1980s, and some of the people are also the same people. So I'm just interested if you have any comment on whether we might see trade frictions move more into the currency area. If we don't see important currency moves, are we going to see potentially, certain currencies deemed as manipulating and specific trade actions or other things to compensate for perceived currency manipulation? Thank you.
Well, I do think there is a growing risk of currencies coming back into the center of trade talks. Forgive me for recalling my own experience, but we made a strong effort in the Reagan and Bush senior administrations to keep currencies and trade separate. Currencies, in our view, should be managed by finance ministries and central banks. In trade, you get all sorts of departments involved in it, right? And we never allowed currency talks to be engaged in broad multi-agency talks. We simply did not. But there were pressures, to be sure. And of course, especially when the yen was so high, or so low relative to the dollar, we had to engage in discussions about the currency, but we did it in a very careful way. I think the problem today is that it has become already very enmeshed in the talks between the U.S. and China. And recently, and I had discussions about this in China earlier this week, recently, the depreciation of the Chinese yuan against the dollar has been quite notable, creating a dilemma for China, because on the one hand, they need to consider easing monetary policy to support the economy. And the economy is weakening in China, by the way. It's weakening. You can tell the confidence of entrepreneurs and businessmen is waning. But if they follow that easy monetary policy to support the economy, they are exacerbating the capital outflows and the downward pressure. The Treasury Department issued a report in, I think, September, maybe? October. And it had a sentence in it which really agitated me, because it said the Chinese currency manipulation has, or maybe it didn't use the term manipulation, Chinese currency policy has imposed a huge burden on the American worker. This was pure populism. And I would never have allowed it into the text of a Treasury document, but I'm not the Treasury official today. It's a sign, however, of what you just expressed a concern about, that currency issues are going to become more captured in the trade issues. I think we have to try to put some of these issues in a professional framework. And I hope that both sides will understand that, and that we will be able to pursue what really matters here. I have made clear my views both to key officials in the Treasury and the White House that currencies are not the heart of the problem. They're not the heart of the matter, to quote Graham Greene. And they should not be the focus of great broad-based negotiation, in my view. You know, the U.S. missed a window, and China missed a window, but I particularly fault the U.S. a decade or so after the global crisis. It was clear that China should be part of the G7. We should have repackaged the G7 and brought China to the table. China has become a key global economy, and their policymakers are capable, skilled, responsible, their economic policymakers are capable, skilled officials. Put aside the politics for a moment. If you're managing the global economy, you'd better get the key players in the global economy around the table. One of the key Chinese officials told me, well, you know, they complain about my currency, but we never talk about it. They complain about my monetary policy, but we never talk about it privately. He said, I can't talk about this in the G20. And of course he can't. Why should the Chinese be talking about the exchange rate policy in front of the Argentinians? It makes no sense. So I'm afraid that opportunity has been lost for a while. I hope that at some point in the next 5 years that the U.S. and the G5, including Japan, are far-sighted enough to bring China into the fold, because so many global problems require cooperation between the U.S. and China.
Okay. Yes, Yu Ching, sorry. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dallara, for your excellent talk. Yeah, I have two questions.
Sorry, could you just say who you are? Introduce
Okay, yeah. My name is Yu Qingxing, a professor of National Graduate Institute for Policy Study, located in Lupangi. I have two questions. The first question is this. Now, you know, many people speculate what kind of result may come out from the meeting between President Xi and President Trump at the G20 meeting. Recently, Professor Peter Dallara gave a very hawkish talk at the CSIS, and the Vice President Pence also published a very similar hawkish article at the Washington Post. In the same time, the economic advisor, Mr. Kudlow, to President Trump, he discredited, you know, what the Peter Navarro said. And now, you know, State Secretary Munich has started his talk with Vice Premier Liu He. I'd like to know, does that mean within the administration, there is kind of split view about how they should proceed with the negotiation with China on the trade war, or whether this kind of attacks it. Some of them play, you know, hawks, some of them play doves. They try to confuse the Chinese government, this one. Second question is, I'm very glad that you're one of the person who has been involved in the Plaza Accord. But you know, like in China, many Chinese scholars and Chinese government officials, whenever they, you know, recall the Japanese experience with the U.S. in the 1980s, they always said, Plaza Accord is an American conspiracy to bring down Japan because U.S. does not want to see Japan, you know, catch up to U.S. So that's why U.S., you know, orchestrated this Plaza Accord. I'd like to have your opinion about this. Thank you very much.
I'm always amazed at the conspiracy theorists who assume a greater degree of coordination and Machiavellian behavior than any government is capable of. Today, the notion that the U.S. is engaged in a very complex public positioning in order to confuse the Chinese is a very misguided idea. The U.S. is confused. China is confused. We're all confused. We're operating in a different system now that's led by a president who is impetuous. And it's very difficult for both the Chinese and for some American officials to know quite how to deal with this. I think what you're seeing is there are different views. This is not new. This has always been the case. But of course, in the 1980s, we did not express those differences very often publicly. I think that has changed over the years. The willingness of officials to speak out in the U.S. publicly, different positions, and to use that to position themselves for the internal discussions in the U.S. We're searching, we're groping to find, I think, some basis for progress. I am not so concerned about these differences of views. I think it's natural. You know, I think it's important to recognize how much our democracy thrives from debate. thrives from discussion, thrives from differences of views. Everyone says we are very divided today. And there is some truth to this. But I think, if I may use another one of my analogies from the past, you know, my second job out of college was to be a navigator on a destroyer. And I was faced with navigating the destroyer across the North Atlantic. It was very rough seas, very rough seas. And I'd been told that ships roll, ships pitch, and they yaw, which means they move back and forth sideways. And during this storm, the ship was doing all of the above. And yet every morning I had to get up and get my sextant. This was before satellite navigation, and try to adjust course, find out where we were in the North Atlantic and adjust the course, because I could never perfectly predict the winds or the currents. I would do the same thing every evening. What we see in today, the rolling in the U.S. may be characterized by divisions on health care and immigration policy. The pitching is the trade negotiations and U.S.-Iran. And the yawing is the internal challenges we have with the Mueller probe and with difficulties between the presidency and the White House and the press. Meanwhile, the system is trying to still adjust course as we go. That's what we did last week. We took a reading of the stars and we said, we better rebalance our system a little bit here. So we brought the Democrats back into control of the House. We brought them in control of 7 states. This is the process of a very turbulent sea around a democracy that constantly has to change course. And the Chinese need to understand it's a very different system. Fortunately, today, my feeling is quite strong that both sides are actually trying to find a basis for solution. You know, in January, if there is no agreement, the tariffs will rise to 25% on a huge amount of goods. And we have already hit the farmers in the knees with our trade war, creating a real problem for soybeans and other agricultural producers. But if we take the next step, we will hit 2 things. We will hit the American consumer right in the solar plexus in the stomach, and we will create a risk of a broader confidence problem in the markets. The markets are not happy. The markets are confused. The markets do not need another hard blow from trade. So I think the Chinese have recognized that this is not about a trade war with President Trump. Maybe initially they thought, if Trump will leave in 2 years, we're going to be fine. The entirety of the U.S. leadership, and I think in Canada, in Germany, even in Japan, there is a broad base of consensus that it's time for China to adjust its position in the global economic system. So I think that awareness is growing in China, and we need to be smart enough in the U.S. to find some solutions that save face on both sides of the Pacific. A long answer, but complex question.
Okay. Can you take another?
Yes, fine. 1 or 2 more.
Yes, if you could keep it fairly short, because there's one more question to come, please.
Yeah, my name is Kurt Sieber. Thank you so much for a very excellent presentation. I have 1 point and 1 question. The point is, I've been a trader in Japan for more than 50 years. And when I came to Japan, $1 US was 360 yen. And we are now at, as you said, about 113 or so on. So actually, the dollar is worth 1/3 of what it was 60 years ago. So I have some problem with Mr. Trump, President Trump, making allegations about the currency manipulation by Japan. I have a different opinion about China, but I'm Swiss by nationality. We have the same system or difference in Switzerland. So I can tell you in our trading, it is impossible to separate currencies from the trade. I mean, that's my practical experience. Thank you. Now my question. The United States is gradually moving out of the QE and raising interest. What would you recommend to Mr. Kuroda to do in Japan? Thank you.
Well, first, let me say I'm proud that Partners Group is also a Swiss firm. We're headquartered in Zug, and we are the largest private equity firm in Europe. And we are very pleased that we are Swiss-based, even operating globally. I think, of course, in the marketplace, you can never separate currencies from trade. My comment was that in negotiations, it's critical to keep them separate, because currencies can easily become a whipping boy. If you just behaved on the currency, all the problems would be solved. It's another delusion to think that currency movement will solve all these problems. I remember when I had to testify in Congress about Japan manipulation of the currency. This is why we press so hard to open Japan's financial markets. Today, Japan's financial markets are quite open, as you know, if you operate trade finance from here. And I think it was important for Japan to open its markets. Today, I do not see a Japanese policy that manipulates the currency. I believe that the dialogue between Japan and the U.S. on these issues remains quite close, and I believe that, of course, the currency is an important consideration, but I don't believe that either side at the moment believes that there is gross misalignment in the U.S. and Japanese currencies. Of course, the dollar is worth 1/3 less than it was when you arrived as a young man, or 2/3 less. But I would say that the Japanese economy today is a totally different animal than it was in those days. As far as China, I would also be cautious about concluding that China is constantly manipulating its currency. China has spent a lot of money in the last 3 months trying to support its currency. Now, I know that China does not have a fully open market financial system, and this is an area where they need to change. And this is an area where the U.S. should press. But again, I think you have to focus on what really matters in the longer run, and that is, I think, issues of opening China's economy to free investment, to non-joint venture investment, to non-technology transfer investment, and also opening the door to a framework which will ensure that China honors global standards with regard to technology transfer. To me, those are the keys and not the currency issues. Maybe time for one more?
Just one more, very quickly, please, if you don't. We are running over time, but please.
My name is is Gerhard Fasoll, and I work for a long time in Japan. My question is a simple one. You mentioned at the end of your talk corporate governance and the importance of teamwork between directors and executives. And so my question to you is, what do you think about Japan's governance reforms? Because you mentioned this teamwork between board of directors and executives. And the traditional way in Japan is that it's the same people, identical, and no outsiders. And the reforms now slowly start to change, attempt to change that. And for several years, I was board director of a Japanese company as an outsider. So what do you think?
I think,
also regarding your investments here in Japan.
well, I think you have put your finger on an area where Japan has not changed as much as it needs to. I think we began to discuss corporate governance reforms with our Japanese friends back in the 1980s, and there has been some progress, but not as much as there should be. I think Japan Inc., Japan corporate structure, would benefit greatly from more outside directors, but also a more active engagement between the board and the management. I believe that the long history of the Keiretsu structure combined with the Japanese culture, and I know the Keiretsu structure has weakened a good bit, but combined with the cultural differences which exist between Japan and the rest of the world, make it difficult for outside directors to be effective. And this needs to be addressed in both language issues, in documentation issues, and I think auditing, accounting, and a broad reform of governance. I support the changes which are underway, but I think much more needs to be done. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much indeed. This has not just been an Asa-kai, a breakfast meeting, it's been a Benkyo-kai, which is a study session, and we've all learned a great deal. You said you'd come back in 10 years' time, but please come back earlier than that. Let me offer you a one-year honorary membership to
Oh, thank you so much. Very kind of you. Very kind of you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.